Enchanted, starring Amy Adams, Patrick Dempsey, and James Marsden. It's the first feature-length film from Disney that mixes hand-drawn animation with live action ever since Who Framed Roger Rabbit. We start off in an animated fairy tale world where Giselle is the stereotypical fair maiden living in the forest and singing with the animals, hoping to one day find her true love, the prince. The prince, named Edward, does actually come along quite soon, and as it often happens in fairy tales, instantly proposes to the girl. When Giselle arrives in the castle to get married, the next day, she is intercepted by the queen, who is the prince's stepmother or whoever. She tricks the young girl and sends her into our world, into real world, into modern day New York, where she finds help and eventually, of course, love in the hands of an attractive lawyer played by Patrick Dempsey. So this setup makes it possible for the movie to go several different ways. Based on the initial scenes of Giselle in New York, I pretty much expected it to go the comedy route, taking apart and making fun of every single trope associated with Disney princesses. But then the prince gets involved, and so does the queen's henchman, and so does the queen herself. And the further we go, the more it becomes what it initially tries to ridicule, the classic tale of princesses and love at first sight. And it's just so very, very weird, because the humor is mostly just dumb and simplistic. The plot is extremely contrived. The sequence of events often doesn't make any sense at all. The real life characters, even though they're clearly meant to be more cynical and jaded than Giselle, kind of a foil to her, rarely behave like normal people. The suspension of disbelief is non-existent in this film because it doesn't seem to have and follow any set of internal rules. The events and situations are not organic, not natural, they just happen in a certain sequence because that's how the story should go. So it ends up being an actual naive, silly, and outdated fairy tale pretending to be a riff on one. It evidently tried to half-heartedly do two things at the same time: laugh at the tropes, but the jokes are not funny, and pay homage to the classics, but without really adding anything new of its own. For one hopeful moment, it seems like the movie is trying to actually have a positive message. Say, look, this whole idea of romantic love is cool and all, but marrying someone you know for one day is kinda insane, and the world is not full of love and rainbows and unicorns, and it's better if you actually have that pinch of skepticism and grow as a person as a result. But then, spoilers, mind you, Giselle seemingly learns that lesson and falls in love with the lawyer who she knows for 2 days, and she decides to spend the rest of her life with him. And he falls in love with her as well, despite clearly being more cynical, but also being in a relationship for 5 years and wanting to propose at the beginning of the film. And his almost fiancée is perfectly fine with it because she meets the prince, and after dancing with him once, she decides to fuck off to fairy tale land and become a princess. What is this? What is this nonsense? And of course, there is a montage in the second act of the film at around the time when Giselle starts to wake up and think for herself and take more agency and become more than just damsel in distress. And that montage is of her, you guessed it, going shopping for clothes. It's quite unbelievable to me that this movie was a thing just over a decade ago, when now Hollywood seems to be all about equality and destroying gender stereotypes and strong heroines and all that jazz. To have such an outdated message of relegating the woman to buying a couple of dresses and having the epiphany that finding a boyfriend is not the most important thing in the world, only to say, well, it kind of still is, but it's just the other guy. It's it's baffling, especially as the other guy is Patrick Dempsey, who is abysmally wooden in this film. There's nothing about his character that is likable or interesting. He seems to have the depth of a teaspoon, and aside from his looks, he is a non-presence. Enchanted as a film also looks and feels excruciatingly cheap, like a TV movie from the 1990s. It's uncinematic, it's unexciting, just boring to look at. It almost makes me sorry for Amy Adams and James Marsden, because Adams is excellent in the role of the naive and simplistic Giselle, and I could even somewhat buy into her doubts and progress as the film went on. I think she takes a poor script and does a better job with it than she has any right to. And Marsden also manages to be rather entertaining as the Domas prince and clearly has a lot of fun in the role. It is a shame that that last thing cannot be said about myself. I had no fun while watching Enchanted. I think it doesn't work as a comedy mixed with a love letter to fairy tales, and it certainly doesn't have a meaningful message of its own to say. Avoid.